In this video, we'll talk about some of the problems in science and what we call the replication crisis. I think this is a very important topic to talk about. We all kind of have this notion or bias to accept everything we read as scientific fact, when it turns out not to be the case at all. We've touched before on the case of Dietrich Stoppel and how he had a whole network of fraudulent data and papers. This, among other instances, started to raise questions about what the standards were in scientific research. People slowly began to realize that maybe we shouldn't blindly trust everything we read, and this was especially the case in social psychology. The reputations of scientists, but also academic journals, took a hit. A famous example now is that of Daryl BEM, who published a study about extrasensory perception in a top-tier journal. On the surface, this paper seemed to be done okay. It had large sample sizes. The paper had 9 different experiments in it. But some of the claims were frankly just unbelievable. For instance, one claim was that extroverts seemed to be able to foresee the location of images before a computer program could even determine the location of it. These findings kind of took the field by storm, especially when under scrutiny it came out that the study didn't use really proper scientific methods at all, and that the results didn't provide any actual credible evidence for extrasensory perception. But it took experts some time to figure this out, leaving a big majority of other scientists and non-scientists taking this as pretty solid evidence. There was a further controversy in science a few years earlier with a paper by John Ioannidis called "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." In this paper, he goes on to say basically that the overwhelming majority of research you read about is actually wrong. This is due to things like studies, first off, having really small sample sizes. Also, if the effect you're chasing is small to begin with, your results will probably be inflated to some degree. Other aspects like financial interests, too much flexibility in designs, and the popularity of some fields to begin with all can lead to wrong conclusions about a topic or paper. So this paper got a lot of traction, and there was a lot of disbelief in the field about it. Science was supposed to sit on this solid foundation of proper research methods and go through strict screenings in the form of peer review, where experts in the field review your paper for errors or shortcomings before it can be published. How are we supposed to believe that this is just all probably wrong now? And a lot of well-known researchers simply wouldn't take this at all in kind of a self-serving bias type of way. Maybe other researchers in the field are wrong, but I've dedicated my life to this topic and I know that my area of research is just fine. Or maybe this was a problem in other fields, but surely this isn't a problem in psychology. Well, starting in 2008 and culminating in a publication in 2015, the Open Science Collaboration recruited several independent research laboratories to gather and replicate the top 100 or 100 most important findings published in only the top-tier psychology journals. These are supposed to be the cream of the crop type articles, the articles that are most heavily cited, that people talk about the most, and that we are supposed to trust the most. So researchers chose these studies and they tried to repeat them in their own labs. The results were actually pretty amazing in kind of a bad way. Of the 97 studies that originally had significant findings, only 35 of them were successfully able to be replicated. So the vast majority of them failed when researchers tried to do them again. And even more, of those 35 studies that actually did replicate, the effect sizes were only half as big as in the original studies. This was a huge blow to psychology. There were already controversies in the field about some studies not being able to replicate, or how some fields published bogus articles, but this sent the field into what we refer to as the replication crisis. Since 2015, psychologists have had to really get their act together and start to really scrutinize the methods of these experiments that are kind of coming out. There are a lot of possible causes of this replication crisis, and a lot of them were described in that earlier paper from Ioannidis about why most published research findings were false, which is kind of spooky to think about that people were already talking about this back in 2005, and the field didn't collectively realize really until 2015 or so. Some possible reasons outlined in that paper were small studies with small effect sizes, running tons of comparisons without really specifying a solid prediction from your hypothesis, having too much flexibility in your designs and outcomes to really test whatever you want, and different types of competing interests. It's also important to state that published research, what you read in journals, is not actually representative of all research. We have a term called publication bias, which is when journals mostly publish research that produces significant differences. This leads to what is known as the file drawer problem, where research that doesn't find anything becomes unpublishable, and all of these null findings are therefore just kind of stored away in this symbolic file drawer, never to be read by anyone. This can bias what we believe because in research there are a lot of studies that just don't work out. So when you read a paper in a journal, chances are there are a couple of studies just like that out there that just didn't work out and weren't published. Then you realize that if you gather up all of these papers, both published and unpublished, the effects that you read about after you synthesize all of this research would become a lot smaller. Small studies are also more likely to produce what we call type 1 errors. This is when you find an effect when in the population there really isn't an effect at all. So it's kind of like a false positive. Say you want to look at the probability of heads occurring on 10 coin flips or 100 coin flips. So which do you think is more likely to produce 70% heads, 10 coin flips or 100 coin flips? Well, it's 10 coin flips. You are more likely to deviate from the mean, in this case 50%, with small sample sizes. And this is true in both coin flips and in behavioral science. So small studies are more likely to deviate from their true population effect, and sometimes this pops up as a false positive. Another possible cause of the replication crisis comes from running too many different comparisons. So there's always a chance of type 1 error, and the more tests that you run, the higher your odds are of finding something that's kind of fake. It's kind of like a fishing expedition where you compare lots and lots of variables against each other until you find something that's significant. What you should be doing instead is specifying in advance what tests you're going to run, and when you do run multiple tests, you need to statistically control for this. Okay, I have here a bit of code that kind of proves this point about type 1 error. Don't be scared from this. You won't have to do any coding in this class, but I'll walk you through what's going on here. So here I'm simulating some data. I have two groups, A and B, and I simulate 30 data points in each group. Importantly, I set both groups to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. So while the points will jump around a bit, over time the means should be the same and there should be no difference whatsoever between groups A and B. After I simulate the data, I run a t-test between the two groups and save what the p-value is. And the p-value is the main inference criteria that we use to determine if something is significant or not. Once I test this, I repeat the whole process 100 times, saving the p-value each time. Finally, I look at all the p-values and count up how many times we would consider that particular test to be significant. At the bottom, we see here that it's 6. So out of 100 times, this is 6% of the time that we're finding a significant effect, even when I set the means to be exactly equal. This is pretty consistent with what we know our type 1 error rates to be, which is about 5%. So say a researcher theoretically runs 100 tests, 5 of them are probably going to turn out significant, even if there aren't any real differences at all. The researcher then takes those 5 findings, which we know aren't real, and they publish them anyway. These kind of tactics, when you really think about them, are quite common. If any of you choose to invest financially in the future, you might go to an investment bank or a place like Edward Jones. Financial experts will then talk to you about a particular mutual fund that they claim that it beat the market by 8% over the last 5 years. But in reality, they won't tell you about the 15 other mutual funds that they had that either didn't beat the market or actually lost money. So they don't tell you about those, they just tell you about the ones that work. And it's kind of the same thing in research. So we know that running a bunch of tests can be a big deal and it can inflate type 1 errors. I just want to take a quick second to make sure that you are all aware of the difference between that and the other type of error, type 2 errors. Pretty much type 1 is when you find an effect that doesn't actually exist. So this would be like a doctor telling this man that he is pregnant when we know that's pretty impossible. And type 2 errors are when you don't find an effect when it actually does exist in the population. So this would be like a doctor telling a pregnant woman that she actually isn't pregnant. Okay, back to more possible causes of the crisis. The next one is harking. This stands for hypothesizing after results are known. Too often, researchers will find something interesting and they will retrospectively go back and create a hypothesis and pretend like they predicted that would happen the entire time. It's really hard to catch someone when they're doing this, which makes me think it's pretty prevalent in the literature. But what you should do is create your hypothesis first, then collect your data, and then evaluate your hypothesis. You can definitely update your hypothesis for future studies, but you can't change your original hypothesis after seeing the outcome of the study. This is a violation of the basic scientific method, and it happens all the time. Next, there can be too much flexibility in designs. When you loosely define a measure or construct, that gives you just too much room to test different things or to change different aspects about a study until something magically works. Good scientific designs need to be strict, rigid, and inflexible. Next, there are financial interests that can lead to bogus research. There are many different types of science that require funding. Most comes through governmental agencies such as the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation, but a lot of private companies also fund research, and these companies also want those results to turn out a certain way, mostly to benefit their company. Earlier on in this lecture series, we talked about the controversy in that paper claiming that vaccines caused autism. This is an example of financial interests leading to false research. Now, I will say that just because research is privately funded doesn't automatically make it bad. All you have to do is just disclose where that funding is coming from. But the thing is, a lot of earlier research didn't really disclose their funding at all. And then another conflict of interest can originate more internally. There's an adage of publish or perish that everyone in the field is widely aware of. In academia, a lot of times to keep your research jobs, you need to produce research results. Things might be changing now, but in a traditional tenure-track position at a university, a researcher has an initial 5-year appointment. After those 5 years, a committee reviews his or her progress, which includes how many publications they have, how many of those they were first author on, and how many were published in top-tier journals. If the researcher doesn't have enough publications, they won't be awarded tenure and their position will be terminated. This puts a ton of pressure on researchers to publish. And since we know that it's hard to publish an experiment that didn't work, this puts a lot of pressure on researchers to engage in some of these bad research practices. In terms of this replication crisis, some think that if we just wait long enough, science will correct itself and that bad research will eventually be debunked. I've even said this in my lectures that science is kind of a self-correcting process. To an extent, this is true, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect process. After a couple of years, there are replications of some projects, and this can provide more evidence for or against a paper, but often this only targets recent research. If a paper somehow slips through the cracks, there's a lot lower chance that it will be challenged or even double-checked. This can leave some research untouched and therefore not really corrected. Another kind of misconception is that the field as a whole will collectively just move away from bogus areas and focus more on areas that are more valid or correct. But this isn't completely true either. Research deals with popular areas. It's kind of fatty. Trends in science moves away from both successful and unsuccessful areas equally. So this really can't be the case either. I guess the point here is that these things are more of a systemic issue than we once realized, and that we can't just leave it up to science as a whole to fully self-correct, and that we need to intervene to fix things. A lot of internet trolls during this crisis period were saying things like, everything in psychology doesn't replicate, or just don't trust psychology. This was pretty damaging to our field. Yeah, we've discovered some pretty serious flaws in our research. I've talked to you in this video about how there's a lot of research out there that you should just be extremely skeptical about. But we're aware of these issues, and changes have been implemented to begin to deal with this. We've changed the way we conduct research, the way we submit research for publication, and the way we publish in general. So I would argue that science is working. This is science getting better and maturing, so if anything, the new research that comes out, we should be able to trust a little bit more, and also while still being aware of its fallibility. We never have confidence in any one single paper, but really as a whole. Okay, so that's it for this video, and we'll see you next time.